Well, hi there. Welcome to the Sorlin Roots podcast, where we journey together into deep discipleship. I'm Brian Fisher, and I'm joined by Dr. Tim Boswell and handsome Kyle Moody, and this is episode 137. We are back in the greenhouse today, and we are going to be going deep on our previous episode, which remarkably was 136, and it was entitled The Prodigal Son and the Christian Mystic. So if you're new to Sorlin Roots, we always recommend going back to episode 1 and starting the journey from the beginning, because each episode and season builds on each other. And you might be a bit disoriented by joining us this late into the discussion. There's nothing current events related that you would miss out. So we always encourage folks to take their time and work through the entire bank of episodes in order. However, if you want a good refresher, I think it's episode 133, whatever, the last episode of season 6, I did my best to summarize the journey so far. So here in season 7, we are embarking on really the central question that we've been leading up to for the last 4 years, which is, how do we become deep disciples? How do we become people of depth? We have explored the problem, the great omission, and we've explored 3 other related issues that make deep discipleship difficult in the modern age. And we've talked a lot about who Jesus is. If we are supposed to become more like Jesus over time, what does that mean? Who is he? And in essence, we're exploring discipleship anthropologically, meaning how does one person become more like another person from the inside out? So we've covered a lot of ground over the last 4 years, but this season is really the answer to how. How do we become deep disciples? Now that we've explored the challenges and we've explored who it is that we wish to become like, what does it actually mean? What does our journey look like into those sort of depths? And to do this, we are first framing what we're calling the good life. Now, we've used a lot of terms to describe this. Deep discipleship would be the same sort of idea. Stage 6 Christian, we've referenced the book The Critical Journey a number of times here. What does a stage 6 Christian look like? What is their heart condition? We've also looked at the with God life. That's Dallas Willard's term. And then a term which tends to be polarizing for reasons I don't quite understand, but Christian mysticism, a Christian mystic. That is somebody who is being transformed from the inside out with an inner union with God, which is entirely biblical and is the point. I think the word mystic just has some modern connotations that some people sort of take offense at. So we are exploring it from a number of different angles, because when we talk about becoming more attuned to God and to ourselves and to others, and ultimately becoming more loving, more like Jesus, we've concluded that process is not just intellectual. It's not just the accumulation of biblical knowledge. It is experiential. The heart itself drawn into a deeper and deeper union with God. And so that is obviously highly relational. And so here in the first part of season 7, we are taking our time trying to paint a picture of the good life from different angles, because it is so rare. As we talked about in the last episode, maybe 2 to 3% of people today who claim to follow Jesus actually experience the good life, or the with God life, or are Christian mystics, or are deep disciples, or are stage 6 Christians. It's a very, very small number if we take the research at its face value. And so I have purposely taken a good portion of this season to back up and say, well, okay, let's just make sure we're all exploring together, what do we mean by the with God life, and why is that different from apparently the vast majority of people in their lives who claim to follow Jesus. And we're also toying now with some of the obstacles that get in our way of the good life in the modern era. And then as we move through season 7, we're going to launch into more of the, I hate to call them practices, but what is involved in becoming a deep disciple? What does it mean to move from a stage 2 Christian or a stage 3 Christian into a life of love? Because ultimately, guys, becoming more like Jesus means that we're becoming love, right? If God is love and we are to become more like him in our limited human capacity, then we are becoming more and more loving. That means we are becoming more and more like love over time. So it's been a fascinating journey. I'm learning a ton. It's been very challenging, frankly, the more that I read and study. I just finished a book about Jonathan Edwards, who would be a Christian mystic. We're going to talk about this next episode. And he talked about the good life using those terms quite a bit. And I think in many cases, people just kind of looked at him very quizzically, like, what are you talking about? So today we're going to investigate again from a different angle what is the good life, and we're going to talk about the 4 obstacles that I very briefly introduced, some reasons why, if vulnerability and surrender are critical to us becoming deep disciples, why is that such a struggle for us? So Doc and handsome Kyle, welcome back. Good to be with you guys.
Thank you.
Great
Good
to
to be
see
with
your
you.
smiling faces.
Yeah.
Yep. As usual, Tim and I wore collared shirts, and Kyle shows up in a dirty T-shirt. So it's great to see that two of us take this very seriously, and one of us still treats it like a bounce house with his kids on Saturday morning.
Okay. Wow, man. Yeah. I think somewhere in the Bible it says, "Ye shall not judge." But there's something about those comments that just because I'm wearing a T-shirt, it's not dirty. It's brand new out of the closet, and it's
what's on the front of the shirt, Kyle? For those that aren't watching,
it's a shirt that I designed.
Yeah, but what's on the shirt?
It's the donkey that Balaam that talked to Balaam.
So
he has a little quote on the bottom that says, "What have I done to you?"
So Kyle has an ass on his shirt.
There it is.
And that's what
and there's the question that I have to ask you, Brian. What have I done to you? Yeah. What? Why do you got to hate on somebody that's just wearing a T-shirt, for heaven's sake?
You tell him, Kyle.
Yes, thank you, Tim.
Good job. Good job sticking up for yourself. As your identity becomes more and more restful in Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As Michelle likes
anyway,
to say, it's more spicy.
So we have today, now we have a 5th obstacle to vulnerability, which is when your close friend criticizes your clothing and calls into question your contribution based on your fashion choices. That's well, maybe next episode. That's the 5th obstacle to vulnerability.
It's a bonus episode.
I am not questioning Kyle's contributions. I'm questioning his fashion choices, and the fact that we are, have an international audience, and Tim and I routinely show up looking nice, like at least we're going to some sort of event, and Kyle shows up, with a T-shirt.
But when you're that handsome, I mean, does it matter what you wear?
It's just a jealousy thing on my part.
Come on.
Yeah. He could show up in a clown suit and still look handsome. That's part of my problem. Maybe it's just jealousy on my part.
It might be. It might be some introspection that needs to happen there.
Anyway, since Kyle continually disqualifies himself from facilitating the conversation with his wardrobe, Doc is going to once again lead us into a facilitated but free conversation about what does the good life actually mean, and what are the 4 or now 5 obstacles to us actually surrendering to that. So, Doc, we're going to turn over to you.
All right. Thank you, sir. So a heads up and fair warning to you both, because I know that we want to model for our listeners much of what we discuss. Some of my questions will be directed to you and to myself so that we can kind of consider in our own lives, what does vulnerability look like and what obstacles might exist for that. And so I'm excited to dig into some of these things with you. But before we get into those 4 obstacles that you explored, Brian, I wanted to mention you talked about studies by the Barna Group and others that have polled those who identify as Christian. And some of the statistics that you mentioned were just staggering to me. For instance, that only about 20% report engaging in daily prayer. Only about 20 to 25% believe that God is relational. And I'm truly not trying to be critical. I certainly don't have all the answers, but many would say that a belief in the importance of prayer and that God is relational are pretty foundational. So in some ways, it seems to me not just that we have, say, 90 to 95% of self-professing Christians that report a close relationship with God, but are missing out still on this incredible, deep, super Christian mystic type of good life that we're describing, but rather that the vast majority, at least of these reporting Christians, are missing out on even the basics of a relational understanding of of God the Father. Do you think that this overlaps with these obstacles to authentic vulnerability that we'll be exploring? What do we do with that?
Yeah, I think the data is shocking, but not surprising in the sense that this is somewhat of what we've been exploring for the last 4 years. I'm rereading some of Dallas Willard's stuff, and I listened to his podcast, and he said, we live in an age where it is very possible to be a Christian and not a disciple. And I think he's right. And by that, and he cites all sorts of reasons, some of which we've explored. But I don't really like the term consumer Christian or cultural Christian. When Barna is doing a study, or Pew or somebody else, they're obviously polling people who self-identify as something, and they are doing their best to affiliate with a certain religion. So obviously there's lots of people who are claiming to follow Jesus, or to at least associate with the Christian religion, that don't have a good sense of what that means. And that's probably true in most world religions. But I do think it speaks to Willard's point that there is very little expectation in many parts of Western Christianity that to be a Christian is to be a disciple. And he noticed that phenomenon 20 some years ago. I don't think it's changed any. And I think you're just seeing that reflected in the data. A couple episodes ago, Kyle and I were sharing how we had dinner with a local pastor in a megachurch, and his comments almost exactly reflected Barna's study. He said that about 80% of people who attended his megachurch, which is a Bible-believing, Orthodox, decent church, have no real relationship or intimacy with Jesus at all. 80% sitting in church every Sunday. So if that's true for a church that is very well known for its adherence to the Bible, I would imagine Barna might be actually a little too conservative. I wouldn't be surprised if some of those numbers that shock you are even higher.
Man, so does that mean that 80-ish% of people that identify as Christian don't really understand what it means to be a Christian? Is that what we're saying? That
I'm not sure if it's understanding as it is they are not experiencing any sort of day in, day out intimacy and personal relationship with Jesus. They might adhere to basic biblical principles, but I mean, this is it's been true certainly in my experience that many people that I meet that say, "Hey, I am a Christian," and I'm not judging their hearts. I'm saying bear little outward fruit of that being the case. Right, they're engaged in a lifestyle or in a way of conducting themselves that doesn't really seem to align with what the Bible would endorse, but they've got punched their ticket to heaven, so they're good to go. That's been pretty normal, at least in my Christian life.
And there are many probably that don't even understand that there's more, right? That they have learned that, or been taught that it is about professing and confessing and believing and being saved, and then just waiting until you die, going to heaven. And that's all there is to it, I think that's one of the themes that has emerged again and again throughout the last few years, is that there is more, but many people don't. Not only do they not realize what that something is, they don't even understand that there is a lack. They don't recognize that something is missing, which to me is incredibly tragic, because our God, as we have experienced him, is deeply relational and very interested in having that kind of intimate connection with each one of us, even when we sometimes may push him away, which I think is one of the things that we'll talk about today. Brian, in the last episode, you said the good life requires vulnerability, and vulnerability is a formation-intensive, not an information-intensive journey. We live and operate from what we love and fear, not from what we intellectually affirm. I want to dig into that a little bit more. I'll use an example from my own family. My 9-year-old has struggled with fear for a long time, being alone, being in the dark. He always wants to be around somebody else in the family. Now, intellectually, he knows there is nothing in the closet, nothing under his bed, nothing anywhere else in the house to hurt him. But he's living and operating from what he loves, being with his family, and what he fears, being alone. So as we mature, the goal, of course, is to try to align our heads and our hearts so that what we consciously know and affirm and believe match up with what we love and fear, and those can be in alignment. But as we've come to see, this is often much easier said than done and requires a vigorous search and intensive efforts. How much do each of you feel that you personally have been able to bring these into alignment, head and heart, what we love and fear versus what we intellectually affirm? And how separated do you think they still are for you?
I think Kyle's probably further along than I am in this, but so I'll just be brief. For me, the process of surrendering and expressing that vulnerability in a time of suffering and disappointment has been a challenge for sure. Because of things that we've talked about before, it's hard for my heart to see or experience God as safe. And I think we're not going to be surrendering and vulnerable until our heart really senses that God is safe. And so in those periods, that creates a disconnect between the head and the heart still. And God in his kindness, I think, has allowed me to experience his safety and security even when life hasn't been particularly safe. But I'm very much a work in progress. So, none of us, I don't think, are claiming that we're stage 6 Christians or Christian mystics. We're simply recognizing that is God's invitation, and we all want that, and we're all on the journey to be there, and we're okay where we are, and God is very patient and loving as we move along. But yeah, I still have a long ways to go to make that connection.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I was going through some old journals of mine over the last 10 years, and I caught myself as I was going through that, and they're all audio journals because I record. It's much easier to get a stream of consciousness on an audio than it is for writing for me. And so I'm listening to this, and I'm like, my tone of voice and the intonations of different things, and I was like, oh my gosh, I caught myself thinking, like just getting really frustrated or angry with myself and thinking like, oh my gosh, what are you doing? But then the Holy Spirit was whispering in there going, why are you doing this? Why are you, this is part of your journey. This is part of what brought you to me right now today. So let's explore that a little bit. And so it was an opportunity for me to think about myself holistically and how far I've come. And that's been the thing that's really started to bring alignment from my head and my heart, is this idea that God has been with me the whole time. That's been the constant. Even if I wander or I stray or I make mistakes or I've misinterpreted or whatever, he's reminding me that, man, you were really chasing after me, even though you're not perfect and you've messed things up and you've screwed things up. I still love you.
That's great. Before we dig into those 4 obstacles to vulnerability, there's something in that story that you mentioned, Brian, that you gave the great example of the child falling and getting hurt and all the reasons that she might not run to her parents even if they're loving. And I resonated with that. You said somewhere along the way, she's already learned not to cry too much, not to make a scene. So the child wipes away the tears and says, I'm fine, even though she's clearly not. I just want to pause a minute on those 2 terrible words, I'm fine. I think those might be the most common lie in modern Christianity. Dangerous and damaging. I'm fine is the enemy of depth. It's the answer we give because we only have 2 minutes before or after a church service. It's the answer we give our friends or family because we are afraid to dig into the truth. It's the lie we tell ourselves when really we're not okay. It's the excuse we give God when we push him away. So why do we insist that we're fine? What would happen if we all admitted that none of us are fine?
There was that song that came out several years ago that said, I'm fine. Yeah, I'm fine. No, I'm not. I'm broken. And yeah, I think there's so many layers to that, but I think it's fear. Like we're afraid to say, no, I'm not, because then it's like, I'm not representing Jesus, because a follower of Jesus is supposed to be fine. And they're supposed to be happy and joyful and all of this.
Yeah, we've mentioned this before, but I keep quoting Dallas Willard, but that's because I keep reading him. But he said, true discipleship really is like an AA meeting. and what we typically experience as discipleship is usually educational or a spiritual high of some kind on a retreat or something, which is fine. But his point is that those that are true disciples are those that are confessional and have dropped their egos and are willing to admit and work through their addictions. The problem is, of course, that those of us that aren't addicted to something in the news don't want to share that. Like it's the vulnerability thing, right? I mean, I'm fine is the ultimate protection against being vulnerable. If we were to adopt the idea that church should be more like an AA meeting, which means you're there, once, 2, 3 times a week, and the purpose of gathering is to confess your sins, is to confess your weaknesses, and to build one another up through a very viscerally authentic experience with each other, I'd expect we'd hear "I'm fine" a lot less, and more of the reality of our situation. Not that we're like 100% of the time miserable or struggling with our addiction. That's not the point. Sometimes we are overjoyed and peaceful, and that's where we should be moving. But the process of getting to the good life has to go through a deep crucible. I don't think there's any other way to get there.
And even just our everyday, regular existences. I think, people have written and studied the social media effect, where the lives that people present on Facebook or Instagram or whatever it might be, invariably skew toward the romanticized, idealized representation of their lives. And it makes other people look at that and think, oh, well, like how happy and constantly joyful and wonderful everybody else's lives is. Everybody else has it together. It must just be me that actually, deals with pain or doubt or sorrow or worry or anxiety. And so since that's not normal, that must not be the Christian thing to do. I'm just going to stuff it all down. I'm not going to deal with it. I'm certainly not going to show it to other people. And I think that's in many ways a natural response, but it's not the healthy response. It's not being risky enough, and we need to be risky in order to make that kind of progress, which kind of moves into my next point. Brian, I'm going to quote you again. I'm going to do that several times from the last episode just to give us some talking points. So you said the first obstacle that is very common for us receiving God's love with vulnerability, even if we're following Jesus, even if we've made a profession of faith, is our need for control. Receiving God's love and vulnerability feels risky because it means relinquishing that grip. This made me think of a fairly recent experience in my own life when my oldest son was the first in our family, the first of our kids to learn how to drive. So I absolutely trust him. I trust his character. But in the early periods of this, when he was learning to drive, I didn't always fully trust his ability to keep us safe while he was learning what to do behind the wheel. Even though he did a great job, he's a great driver, we'd get out there and I'd want to, put my foot through the floorboard or reach over and intervene. Just like when I'm riding shotgun while my teenager is driving, even if he's doing a great job, we want to be in control because we think it makes us safe. I think that's the core of it. Now, does it make us safe for us to be in control? Clearly not. I can look at my life and it does not always make me safe to be in control. Why do you think we cling to that illusion that control means safety?
I just kept thinking about the scene in Fight Club where they're in the car and Tyler is screaming at Edward Norton's character and saying, "Just let go." And he's like, okay. And then what happens? There's this horrific crash, right?
Right.
And so for me, there's a fundamental truth in that. Like when I think Jesus does offer us and invite us to let go. I mean, I've felt that invitation from him, but I think it's a trial and error process. Like sometimes we're like, well, what do I need to let go of this? Do I need to let go of that? And to me, that's what creates the intimacy. When you're talking to God about that and having dialogue with him, and then all right, well, I should let this go or I shouldn't let this go.
I think the need for control always gets back to trust. There are varying degrees of trust. So I've said on this program and in writing that I have no problem trusting God for my eternal security, but I have great deal trusting Him for my daily bread. So it's not that we just trust Him implicitly with everything, because we don't, because we want to assert control. And the reason is because we fear that if we do surrender some of those things, His definition of goodness is different than ours. That continues to be a critical point in my own journey, that my definition of what is good for me and my loved ones may not match up with God's definition. And I don't want His goodness. I want my goodness. Because His goodness might involve risk, it might involve sacrifice, it might involve suffering, it might involve a different layer of freedom that I don't want. So it's a deeply internal thing. But, you're using the driving example. So my older son's been driving for 10 years. I still won't get in the car with him. It's not like he's not capable of driving, but I've seen him drive. I don't trust him to preserve my life particularly well if I get in the car with him. I don't think it's a sign of immaturity on my part. It's more a sign of responsibility. But when it comes to God, I also don't want to get in the car with God sometimes, because there might be a crash ahead that is still for my goodness, but I don't want it.
For me too, it comes back frequently to, if I'm truly being honest with myself, there's a point where I only truly want God's will for my life if it aligns in certain ways with what I hope to happen.
Right.
If I'm really being deep bedrock frank with myself, when I seek God's will authentically, there's that part of my heart that is so hard to let go of, because there are risks and there are things that I'm afraid will happen, and that's challenging. And of course that overlaps with the other three obstacles. All of these are deeply intertwined, as I'm sure you saw as you were exploring those for the episode. Brian, all four of them kind of work in tandem. As you mentioned, the possibility of that crash up ahead that might be goodness, and the fact that pain might actually be beneficial for us, or at least something that God can use to bring great goodness out of. That's our second obstacle. You said the second obstacle is our avoidance of pain. We assume pain is something to outrun, to numb, to explain away, especially having grown up in cultures where pain has been positioned as something universally bad or even unnatural. But anthropologically speaking, pain is inevitable. It's not that we face pain that defines us. It's how we move through it and with whom, which I think was terrific. I agree. It's not about whether we will experience pain. We will experience pain, but our response to it. And, we live in a culture of endless comfort and endless seeking after comfort. And there are some loud voices in modern Christianity that would even argue that if you're not in comfort, God must not be blessing you, or at least that seems to be the implicit underlying message. So it's no wonder that people are reluctant to engage with their pain or view it as anything but a strong, resounding negative to be avoided at all costs, even though pain can be transformative. Brian, I think this is a quote you've used before, but I'll bring it out again. C.S. Lewis writes in The Problem of Pain, quote, "We can ignore even pleasure, but pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world," end quote. So again, being vulnerable, how have you seen this playing out in your own life, or you can talk about in Christianity at large?
Yeah, I'm not as advanced in my experience as Kyle is on this. The last five, and I've shared part of my story with you guys in our audience, but the last 5.5 years have been a time of intense pain, physical pain, unlike anything I've experienced, and emotional pain, unlike anything that we've experienced. And, I was thinking about this, and here's an example. So in 2020, our family went through a radical shift due to some personal betrayals. And because of those betrayals, we had 10 to 12, maybe 15 close friends, folks that we had ministered to and had been in deep relationships with, that overnight disappeared. And so I was thinking about this a couple weeks ago. It's like, being on a bus with your close friends and family and getting in an accident and everybody passes away except for you. And you're left sort of alone with grieving all of those relationships, except when it's betrayal. And so if somebody passes away, there's a reason why they're not contacting you, right? That makes sense. At least there's some closure there. But in our case, it was like we were the ones that had died because everybody else was still living, and yet we were immediately divorced from their presence. And so I was, I get bothered sometimes that it still weighs on me, those lost relationships after a long time. It's been 5.5 years. And then I started thinking like, well, but isn't that kind of normal? I mean, if you lose 10, 12, 15 of your closest friends and work associates or family members overnight, it's not something that your heart's necessarily going to recover from in a day or a month or even a decade, depending on the closeness of those relationships. And that causes you to sit back and really question how God is present in that pain and what he's doing through it. Because obviously he knew that these circumstances were all going to come to pass. So if we really believe Romans 8:28, which I think is overquoted, but I'm going to quote it anyway, for we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love him and are called according to his purpose, then that's usually not a good thing to bring up to somebody in the middle of their pain. But as we move beyond those events and beginning to be at those points, we'd say, okay, well, how is God present in that, and what is he doing? And I do think it is an invitation into a deeper intimacy with Jesus, because sometimes that can only come when we lose other things, and there's some shredding or some pruning or some giving away of parts of our lives that we may have been unconsciously inappropriately tied to, and we didn't even know it. We get to the point of Peter, which is when there's nothing left, where do you go? And when Jesus is all that's left, sometimes that's the best place you can be, right? Even in the midst of the pain. So I'm pretty infantile in my exploration of this, not my experience of it, because it seems like our lives over the last 5 years have just been a compression of pain in a short amount of time. And many of our listeners have gone through very similar experiences in different ways: deaths in the family, or job losses, or betrayals, or abandonment, or divorce, or illness, or whatever. My experience is not unique by any stretch, but how we live through it is really is essential. And do we surrender to Jesus's invitation to be with us in the pain and to transform us in the middle of the pain? And that there is a surrendering that has to happen to be transformed through it.
And in my own life, in the most painful moments is when it's hardest to be vulnerable with God, to press into his presence. I don't know why, because I know he's loving, I know he's there, I know he's gracious. But in those moments, sometimes I don't even want to be comforted. I don't want to stop being angry. I don't want to stop feeling hurt. It's just too much. And the idea that maybe somehow this could all work together for my good isn't even comforting at that time. It's the last thing that I want to hear. But when we can be transparent and raw with God, at least, like you keep coming back to, Kyle, at least we're with him. And Brian, as you talk about with the with God life, we are pressing into him, even if it's to rail, even if it's to lament and to grieve with God. And ultimately that's going to deepen and strengthen the relationship, so that as we emerge from the pain, we have that closeness with him, which is greater than it ever was before. I think where it gets truly sad and painful and difficult is when you combine a time of intense pain with this third obstacle that you mentioned, Brian, to vulnerability, which is this feeling of shame and unworthiness. So if we feel that we aren't, like God couldn't possibly love us, if we feel that he is ashamed of us, that he thinks poorly of us, that when he looks at us, he just sees a total wreck and a mess and wants to look away, it makes it even harder to press into that closeness with him. So Brian, you said the third obstacle is feeling that we're not worthy of receiving God's love. Early on, the message is learned: don't be a problem, don't need too much, don't fall apart. And over time, that becomes the quiet belief that we are too broken, too needy, or simply too much to love, so we quietly question our value. That's what you said last episode. I really resonate with this too. We've learned not to make a scene or be a problem. I don't want to cause trouble. I don't want to make a scene or put people out. Why do I feel that way? Our feelings of shame and unworthiness, they may come from our personal stories. They might come from our upbringing, from our friends, from church pulpits, from fire and brimstone sermons, from our family of origin. We think we're talking about the maker of the universe here. Who am I to be the apple of his eye? How could he possibly value me that much? Surely God's reckless love doesn't apply to me. Surely those verses are about somebody else. How do you guys think that we can work through these ideas and reveal them for the lies that they are?
This one I do have probably a better grasp on, only because that has to do with identity, right? So in 2023, when I got sick, my condition went on this rapid decline over the last quarter of 2023. And so for 2024, which was the worst year of this illness, for the first 6 months, I think I left the house 3 times total because I was so ill that I not only did I not feel well enough to leave, but I didn't want to leave. And so the point is that I couldn't work, continue to work on Soil and Roots because I could still read and I could still write at my computer. But in terms of being productive or performing, I was basically useless. And to experience uselessness when you're used to being very performance oriented, and let's just face it, modern Christianity usually propels that idea in the way that it's manifested in many churches, it causes you to confront really quickly, does God care for me when I'm not doing anything for him? Because the shame messages when you're a performance oriented person who can't perform or who doesn't perform well are extraordinary. And throughout that 6 to 8 months of being quarantined in the house, and not performing and not making a living and not earning anything, there were some very dark moments of shame. And I think that can only really be resolved and healed by surrendering to an experience with Jesus where you accept his delight and his affirmation and his adoration for what it is and for not what you do.
That's beautiful. But it was born out of something very, very difficult and very challenging and confusing. And
like Brian said, this goes back to trust, right, in God's character. Everything that you were describing has to do with how you see God, how you view his character and his disposition toward you. And that's really the fourth obstacle that Brian outlined. The fourth obstacle is mistrust of God's character. This idea of saying, I'm not sure God is actually safe or really good. Brian, you said, many of us believe God is real, even loving in theory, but we're not quite sure he's safe enough to entrust our full selves to. So we remain guarded, missing the very love that could heal us. And of course, as you've said, this goes back to ideas in Soil and Roots lingo, these unconscious assumptions that drive us that often remain unexamined and completely under the radar because they are unconscious. And how we view God, how we see his character below the surface, beneath our conscious statements of faith, is vital to how we are going to relate to him. And of course, this connects directly to our openness and willingness to receive love, which, as you've been talking about, is so central to our own transformation. So the last part of the last episode that I'd like to talk about is your segment about the prodigal son. So Brian, last time you said, as much as this parable of the prodigal son has been taught and taught, what is really discussed is actually the son's response once the father ignores his speech. What does the son do? We know the father offers him unconditional love, but the son receives the father's unconditional love with vulnerability. So this goes back to that David Benner quote we've used many times. I'll reference it again here for our audience. Genuine transformation requires vulnerability. It is not the fact of being loved unconditionally that's life-changing. It is the risky experience of allowing myself to be loved unconditionally. End quote. So we're, of course, called to give love and show love, and that is a prime part of being disciples of Christ. But real transformation is about receiving love, and I'm still personally trying to get my head around this. I'd like to give one more C.S. Lewis quote that I think applies powerfully here. And for a bonus, it connects to the obstacle of pain, which we've also been talking about. So this is C.S. Lewis from The Problem of Pain. He says, quote, "The problem of reconciling human suffering with the existence of a God who loves is only insoluble so long as we attach a trivial meaning to the word love and look on things as if man were the center of them. Man is not the center. God does not exist for the sake of man. Man does not exist for his own sake. Thou hast created all things, and for thy pleasure they are and were created. We were made not primarily that we may love God, though we were made for that too, but that God may love us, that we may become objects in which the divine love may rest well pleased." End quote. So the prodigal son did not need to earn his way to his father's good pleasure. He needed to recognize and receive it. He was made for his father's love as we were made for ours. So it's harder for me personally to receive grace and love than it is to give it. What about for you guys as we kind of head toward circling the runway here? How does this resonate with you?
It's been very, very difficult for me to receive that. And when you mentioned that perspective on the prodigal son, I had never really thought about it like that. I'd never really thought about how he responded, and done a deep dive into that. And I love imaginative prayer and going into all that stuff. And so it was really interesting to think about him choosing to receive and just allow himself to be showered with love and affection and attention and glory and presence with his father. And not say, well, wait a minute, I don't deserve this, or no, you shouldn't do this, or I don't, whatever. I catch myself thinking, can it really be that good? Can it really be, is this really what God wanted? I mean, I've experienced him. I've experienced that love, that kind of intimacy with God, with Jesus, and with the Holy Spirit. And yet I still, like when we're talking about in situations like this, or if I'm talking to somebody else, or if I'm reading something or going through an exercise or whatever, it's like, man, is it okay for me to really think that God loves me this much and that I can be just me and I don't have to do all of this other stuff? I mean, he just loves me for who I am.
Yeah, I mean, we practice contemplative prayer in our greenhouse. And matter of fact, that's a spiritual discipline we're practicing right now, which is quietly inserting yourself into a Bible story and seeing where it goes. It's the use of imagination in spiritual formation. And so I've thrown myself into this story as the younger son. And my honest reaction when the father approaches me as I'm heading home, ready to give my speech, and unlike the son in the story who just readily accepts it and goes in and allows him to be celebrated, I insist that I work off my debt. I say, look, I appreciate that. I receive it, but just let me be a servant for a while and let me work this off. Like, that is my guttural response to the story. So what does that say about where I am with Jesus? Well, obviously, the four things that I've shared that are obstacles are very real to me. Mm-hmm. And I'm trusting that we're working through those together until I'm at the point where I can picture myself as a younger son who allows himself to be celebrated regardless of what he's done and to receive that love. But that's why we practice contemplative prayer, to be able to understand these things. So I'm always reminded of C.S. Lewis's book, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, where Eustace Scrubb turned into a dragon, and the process of being descaled and being returned to a human boy is very, very painful, and at the same time a relief. And certainly in my life, that has been the experience that I've been going through for the last several years. And I'm not quite descaled yet, but there's joy in that journey, even through the pain.
We're all in that journey together.
Well, thanks for leading, Tim. Great job. Kyle, thanks for your beautiful contributions despite your shoddy wardrobe. And we're just grateful that you guys are willing to be a part of all that we're doing here. And thank you to our audience, whether you are watching or listening or reading. We're just glad you're with us. We recognize that the Soil and Roots podcast is not a Bible study. It's not a teaching podcast. It is an exploration of the deep things of what it means to become more like Jesus. And, the fact that you're with us, I think, gives us great encouragement that we are not taking this journey by ourselves, that there are folks in different parts of the world that yearn for a deeper, richer, more intimate presence of the Lord in their lives, and recognize that there is a surrendering process to that, and are willing to surrender together. So thanks for surrendering with us. If you want more information on Soil and Roots, you can check us out at soilandroots.org. We are on social media. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Soil and Roots Podcast, and on YouTube and Substack, if you like long form reading, at just Soil and Roots. Today's episode was produced by Zach Fisher, and we're grateful for his efforts on our behalf. And again, we're glad that you're with us. We will see you next time. Humana. Do your vocal
It's denied.
exercises.
A bank loan. Broccoli, cauliflower.
Bobbity, bobbity, boo.
Me, mamo, moo.
Check.
Used to do it
1,
like
2.
choir.
Sibilance. This is
Sibilance.
mic number 1. Isn't this a lot of fun?
Erudite.
Kayas.
Chiasmus.
Chiasmus.